So I ordered a Subway from Subway.
Radio Free Innsmouth episode 383. This is the other episode that kind of sloughed off of the abandoned Ohio death metal episode due to me having too much to say about a couple of the bands to fit them all into like a 3-packer. This time around we're talking about Leveled. Last week was Clean Flesh, a really interesting project from the eastern suburbs of Columbus. This time Leveled, they're from half an hour north of Dayton. So again, not really an area that's well known in the popular extreme metal consciousness for being a metal haven like Tampa or Oslo or Stockholm or New York. But there is a lot of good stuff in Ohio. Hence why the initial plan was to do an Ohio death metal episode and call it Bands from Ohio That Aren't Regurgitation. That's what I told you last time, which was sort of half the truth. I was actually kind of 50-50 on that title.
So what I told you was true. From a certain point of view.
A certain point of view?
I thought about calling it Death Metal from Ohio That Isn't Regurgitation, like how I did the Texas death metal episode, TXDM That Isn't Devourment. But I was also heavily considering calling this Ohio death metal episode Death Metal from Ohio That Isn't Gutted, for a couple reasons. One, I already did an episode on Gutted a little over 3 years ago, episode 219. It was also about Baphomet Banished. And
Number 2.
Gutted's like one of my favorite bands of all time. I listened to crappy MP3s of their long out-of-print albums all through high school, and as soon as they did a self-released repress of the Bleed For Us to Live album back in 2007, you know I ordered that shit. Alright, if you can't get down with
Go to the ear, nose, and throat department. Get your hearing checked.
probably my favorite band from Ohio, and I bring them up in this Leveled episode because I feel like Leveled has a lot of stylistic overlap with Gutted and took that sort of sound to some interesting new places. Leveled are probably most famous amongst modern listeners nowadays for being the prior band of one of the guitarists for the Reefer Hut.
I smoke weed.
Who are, at least as far as I can tell from looking at pictures of flyers for concerts in the area, something of a scene leader for the Piqua, Ohio area. Like if you look back in the late 90s, early 2000s, Deeds of Flesh is coming, Dying Fetus is coming, Suffocation's coming. The Reefer Hut's always opening shows in that part of Ohio. Metal Fartchives describes them as death metal / hardcore, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with. My favorite material from them, their demos, which actually were recorded prior to the Leveled guy joining, are much more along the lines of the kind of weirdo, brutal death metal, experimental genre mashing shit you might get from Wicked Innocence or even from Dripping, but with that sort of mechanized misanthropy and weirdness that only an Ohio drum machine based project can bring.
He's more machine now than man. Twisted and
Dank.
You got your chug riffs, but then you got these weird Obscura era Gorguts, fucking psychedelic lead guitars. Quite a bit of industrial here too, not just from the drum machine. The vocals themselves feel very mechanistic and processed, like a death metalized version of something you might hear from a band like Screw. But the groovy, brutal death metal core is there. And as I mentioned earlier, the solos are all over the place. They're really weird, psychedelic, kind of floaty, ethereal sort of creatures. Definitely some weird weed-influenced death metal experimentation. When you get to their proper studio recorded material, I'm not really as into it. I don't know about death metal / hardcore. That sounded about halfway between something like Pantera, which I'm already not huge on, and pretty much some kind of nu metal. Just not really the sort of thing that I'm into. The closest stuff I listen to that on a fairly regular basis and enjoy would probably be Keyboard and I guess some prong stuff. It's probably a lot of fun in a live environment. Probably one of the better examples of whatever you would call that sort of subgenre, but it's a little bit too...
You saying?
Cheer up, man. What are you doing?
Turntables, you boy. All right, enough of that, enough.
But enough John about the Reefer Hut and Gutted. I just wanted to briefly go over those two bands to give you an idea of where level they're coming from. They got a lot of that groove, melody, and really tight songwriting you'd expect from Gutted, but at the same time, they got a lot of weirdo experimental stuff, and this results in one of the best and most unique sort of late 90s, early 2000s death metal albums that come out of the US. In fact, the only reason this isn't seen as some sort of classic is due to the distribution not being great. You know, the album's long out of print, not too many people have heard it, and due to coming out into what was kind of a low point for metal as a genre overall in terms of the popular consciousness. As soon as you get into the guts of the first song, you know you're dealing with some very groove-influenced death metal. Thick bass, very dense guitar sound, but the points of groove are very nicely sort of cut up by technical flourishes in the tails of the riffs. Vocal performance kind of napalm death-ish. You got these kind of screams, we always called them the Beavis vocals. And those screams are bounced off of the death grunts, which are particularly well done in the case of Level. Really accentuates that choppy riffing style. And like with Gutted, there's quite a bit of hardcore and even 80s thrash metal and how they stack these grooves up on top of each other. Here comes a pretty cool transition, leaning into more of a rolling sort of groove. Catchiness is kind of this album's middle name. A lot of really catchy riffs, memorable, but then this happens.
What?
I told you, the experimentation, while not as goofy as it got in the Reefer Hut, it's definitely a component of this release. And it often manifests in the form of these very well done melodic sections. Like this lead guitar is a lot more proggy, a lot more technically adept than you would typically expect for this sort of very chunky style primitive death metal. But they bring back a new form of that riff from earlier to kind of bring it back around into something a bit more normal sounding, at least what you would expect to be normal from a band like Level. That sort of weirdo experimentation isn't just limited to, okay, stop, we're gonna do some melodic shit for a while, closed off sections either. A lot of times it's much more fully integrated into the band's overall riffing style in a very interesting sort of way. You'll get a song like Fate that starts out almost kind of Reefer Hut-ish, maybe a little bit of hip-hop to some of these grooves, particularly with that one guitar noise almost kind of mimicking a DJ scratch. But then when the guitars properly come in, it turns into this doomy, very epic, almost sort of heavy metal type thing, very atmospheric. Like check out this little flourish right here. And then another rhythmic variant of that same sort of chugging riff that takes us into some downright sinister sounding melodic tremolo picking, maybe even almost kind of black metal sounding, and yet not out of place with the larger death metal chug atmosphere. It slots in quite cleanly with the next chug riff, which also continues to incorporate some of that tremolo picked melody in a much choppier form. Then you get a full stop into this weird shit. Very Cannibal Corpse-y with those trills and that waltzy kind of rhythm, but they use that as a springboard to get into one of the most thuggish riffs of the album. Check it out. You get this super rhythmic, vocal-heavy part punctuated by the dun-dun chug, which then starts to circle around on itself in a faster variation before we bring back that doomy atmospheric riff from earlier, this time with those impeccably done leads over the top of all of it, just kind of floating in space, eventually coming back to that more black metal-y sounding riff from earlier. None of that sounded particularly out of place or sectioned off to me. It all flows very well, despite their incorporating a lot of styles usually seen as rather disparate. That sort of Gutted meets black metal kind of thing isn't just a one-off for Leveled either. It happens more and more often as you go through the rest of the album. Sometimes the contrast is very obvious. You get a riff that comes in melodic tremolo picking and ends on chugging. This right here is a really clever sort of variation on the opening riff of the song Uncensored, which then transitions to again more of an atmospheric sort of mode with that mid-paced double bass providing a platform for these very floaty sort of riffs. And then they let you know that they're going to get heavy. Intensely thuggish riffage right here, but they do jump back to that more black metal-y style. Almost kind of 90s Marduk sounding, with those tremolo picked melodies and that very loud bass. Not nearly as black metal-ophobic as a lot of brutal death metal tends to be. Then we get into a fade out, which seems like it'll be leading to another kind of odd experimental section, but then you realize that keyboard melody, this is a variation of that riff from earlier. So it actually does make some kind of logical sense. This ain't Dillinger Escape Plan. This stuff is all very carefully constructed, down to the way they use the drums in almost an orchestral manner during the soft sections like these. And with that chug, we get into some even more black metal kind of sounding stuff, with this slowly unfurling, again, very atmospheric, melodic sort of guitar riff that leads up to another chugged full stop. Then they bring in the thuggish chugs again, some of the most brutal groove-inflected shit of the album, particularly once they get up to the next sort of full stop with that squeal again. Almost kind of wiggerish, and yet they managed to make it work alongside all of the more melodic, almost kind of black metal-y, atmospheric kind of shit. It's a very interesting blend of styles that I haven't really ever heard done successfully anywhere else. Honestly, the closest thing might be a really weird band like Dubbuck or something, or Thundercraft. You keep going through the album, the experimentation increases yet again. About 2/3 of the way through this album, you bump into this track, 20 Days Dead, and shit kind of goes dungeon synth for a bit. Wouldn't sound out of place as a summoning interlude or even an instrumental track on certain Burzum albums. Surprisingly well done stuff within this genre, particularly for an ostensibly brutal death metal band. Then the next track, Bread for Blood, takes that same sequencer melody but chops it up via the hacksaw medium of death metal. It really does feel like an expansion of the keyboard experimentation Gutted was doing, particularly on their second album. Then we get that same melody again, but now it's been black metalified. Listen to that loud melodic Marduk bass. Then another thuggish chugging section that nonetheless preserves the melodic spirit of the riffs that came before it, lurching around rather menacingly.
Do you fondle your genitalia on stage? Yeah. Whenever possible.
But it's not too long before we hit another melodic section. Also hearing a decent amount of late 90s death, the progressive era going on here. Then it goes back into chugging. It's all about this tug-of-war dynamic between those two very opposite sort of styles that somehow manage to coexist. Like right here, very black metal sort of riff, very black metal sort of drum beat, but then they switch that drum beat up to more of that mid-paced, early Vital Remains kind of rolling atmospheric death metal beat to change the context of the riff, before then heading into another chug-based section, but this one isn't thuggish like the last one. Instead, it's very atmospheric, kind of open-ended, expansive, providing a very effective platform for the melodic lead guitarist to take flight from. And then we get to the way this album ends, which is absolutely perfect. It starts off with an entirely instrumental track entitled Celestial Justice. I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but I absolutely love the echoey, kind of clean guitar tone that this album utilizes during moments like these. Reminds me quite a bit of At the Heart of Winter era Immortal. Then the drums come in, you start hearing that crazy fucking lead guitar spooking around in the background. Then the real big boy guitars come in. You might remember back on the Texas Death Metal episode, I talked a lot about how certain Prophecy songs had lead guitar that almost reminded me of Manila Road at times. That goes double or perhaps triple for leveled here. Mark Shelton looks down from Valhalla upon this part of the song and smiles. Then the chug riffs come in and it's like a total synthesis of the two very disparate styles of this album, before then hitting some very progressive sounding melodic stuff. Again, quite a bit of late 90s death going on here, at least to my ears, in addition to a decent amount of black metal coexisting alongside brutal death metal, and some melodies that are just kind of uniquely leveled sounding. Unquestionably, this is one of the best instrumental death metal tracks of all time. And all these swirling melodies coalesce into a repetition of sort of the main riff of this track. If you can even really call it a riff, it's definitely more of just a composition. A level of sophistication that you would not expect from something connected to a band called The Reefer Hut.
Dude, this weed is so good!
But speaking of pleasant surprises, the final track on this album, entitled Only in Scripture, is this massive death metal epic, continuing that soulful melodic style of the instrumental that came before it, combining it with elements of brutal death metal, melodic black metal, all sorts of shit that have happened all over the album. It's all here in one track and it's amazing. This one's got another long synth-heavy intro. I believe the longest, most in-depth example of this style on the album. Then the drum machine kicks in and it sounds like a fucking summoning album. It sounds like a really good summoning album, more importantly. But it also maintains that distinctly leveled style atmosphere. And it's all building up to one of the most revelatory melodic motifs of the album. I don't know how you can hate on this riff.
What happened? Your balls drop off?
It exists in this magical space between something like early Satyricon and something like, I don't know, the Chasm. It's fucking nuts. And then when the chugs finally kick in, it's like a total synthesis of the two styles. It's got that same sort of epic melodic quality while maintaining the thuggishness required of this style of riffage. Then it goes into this fucking crazy like immolation, incantation, dissonant shit. So fucking good. With Clean Flesh, I've been into them for maybe 4 or 5 months. I've been sitting on this leveled album for like 2 years, waiting for it to kind of bore me. You know, like one day I'll put it on and I'll be like, oh, this isn't actually the greatest thing ever. Hasn't happened yet. So I figured it was time to finally cover it, because this is some of the best fucking death metal I've ever heard. Bro, are you hearing these fucking riffs? Are you experiencing how well this album is put together? Check out this sequence right here. Really nice riff going into it. Kind of mechanistic, chugging, flowing melody. And then watch how they vary it up. Like, that shit's just downright clever, genius level. And then, of course, back into that epic fucking flowing, melodic, bass guitar heavy kind of melody. That's what I'm talking about when I say this is some of the best fucking death metal ever. Just some of the best metal ever. I'm 100% okay with pretending that this is the third gutted album, but at the same time, that almost does a disservice to how good this album is, how unique it is. Because it's got that gutted style, but it takes it to these like unexplored places. It's a really solid fucking album all around. And unfortunately, really fucking hard to find.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
For real, it was put out on this tiny label called Aurora Records, but I'm pretty sure it was self-released because I can't even find anything else from that label. It was put out once in 1998. No reissues anywhere. I keep checking on Discogs. I've been doing this for a while. Hopefully it comes up for sale someday so I can fucking buy the goddamn thing. Because man, is this album ever sick. And hopefully, by my putting this episode out, I can somehow contribute to getting this album back in print because it's essential fucking death metal. Hopefully you agree with me on that, but even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching or whatever you did, and I'll see you next time.
Oh, whoops! Oh, I dropped my monster condom that I used for my Magnum Dom.